Hi guys, Ronnie here. Bottom brackets seem to be quite a confusing subject for a lot of cyclists nowadays because there are many different crank and bottom bracket standards in various different formats. I also get a ton of requests based on compatibility, and I realized that these generally cause a lot of headaches. So what I've decided to do is put together a very detailed, easy to understand and comprehensive guide about bottom brackets and cranks. In this first part, I'm going to discuss cranks and more specifically crank spindles, because if you want to understand bottom brackets, then first you need to understand the cranks and how they interact with the frame and the bottom bracket. So the first thing that's important about the spindle is its length. Now there are many different lengths in minute variations from different manufacturers, but I'm only going to divide the cranks into two categories. So the first one is a long spindle, the second one is a narrow spindle. Now a narrow spindle crank will only fit a narrow bottom bracket with a standard width of 68 millimeters. These are not very common nowadays, and a lot of standards actually use the so-called long cranks, which have much wider application. As I said, they differ slightly in length, but for ease of understanding, I fit them into these two categories. The second variable when it comes to a crank spindle is its diameter. And there are two main diameters used nowadays and two that are not all that common. So the first one is the small diameter. Again, I could just divide these into a small and a large diameter crank. So the small diameter crank is a 24 mil crank. And the most common one of all of these is the Shimano Allotech 2. This is used basically in every modern Shimano crankset, both mountain bike and road bike versions. The mountain bike, of course, is a tiny bit longer to fit the wider Q factor and the wider BB of a mountain bike frame. The second one is also very common. It's a SRAM GXP bottom bracket. This one differs slightly. It's still a 24 mil bottom bracket, but on the non-drive side, this tapers down to a 22 mil and has a step. And this is due to the different bottom bracket construction, because with the Allotech 2 crank, you need to preload the bearings at the crank. But due to this step design, the SRAM GXP version doesn't require such preload. The third one is the Rotor 3D24 crank. Now Rotor mainly make 30 mil cranks, but this one is designed to be compatible with frames and bottom brackets that can only accept a 24 mil crank, and FSA actually do the same kind of stuff. So FSA also make 24 mil cranks. These four manufacturers all make 24 mil cranks, and one thing that's easily distinguishable is that all of these spindles are made out of steel. The larger ones usually are made out of aluminum. A common feature of these 24 or small diameter cranks is that every one of them is, as I call it, the long spindle. So they can fit even the widest frame standards. And because of the smaller diameter, if you have a large diameter frame standard, then you can always reduce it to a smaller one. So if you take physical compatibility, these small diameter cranks are going to fit basically every bottom bracket on the market. Now if you go further, then the 25 mil diameter crank is only used by one manufacturer in one type of crank and bottom bracket configuration. This is the Campagnolo Ultra Torque, and it will only fit Campagnolo Ultra Torque bottom brackets, which are compatible with many frames. The difference, or the main difference between a Campagnolo crank and all the other ones is that in this system the bearing is actually pressed on the crank spindle. SRAM have just recently released their dub system. So this contains a 29mm diameter crank, and it's very similar in terms of compatibility with the Campy. So it only fits a dub bottom bracket, but dub bottom brackets are created for all the other frame standards. Some older SRAM cranks use this standard or this kind of spindle. The modern S-Works cranks use this kind of spindle, and as far as I know, even the Cannondale hologram cranks can be sorted to this category. So as I said, these are short, oversized spindles. That means they will not fit a frame with a wide bottom bracket. That narrows it down to basically everything that's oversized because of the diameter, of course, and then also the width, so we can only fit bottom brackets that are narrow. That means 68mm. These are the BB30, BB30A, PF30, PF30A bottom brackets. The spindle types, these cranks have the least amount of compatibility. Then if you talk about oversized cranks that are in the long spindle category, these are much more compatible with different kinds of oversized bottom brackets. The new SRAM and Quark cranks all use this kind of setup. FSA has invented basically this type of oversized long spindle, and Rotor also make these kind of cranks together with other small manufacturers as THM, Lightning, etc. If you go back to Rotor for one bit, Rotor actually make two kinds of these cranks. So if you have a Cervelo bike and it came with a Rotor crankset as standard, it's specific to the BB Right system. So a crank like this will only fit a Cervelo BB Right frame, or actually nowadays Factor bikes also have BB Right frames, so that one is very limited. The aftermarket cranks from Rotor, however, have a long oversized spindle, so this will fit basically every standard that's compatible. Another notable exemption will be the Campagnolo over-torque system, which basically builds up on the ultra torque, just takes the crank spindle diameter up to 30mm. Okay, now I have described every type of crankset that you can find on a modern bike. In the next videos, I'm going to describe and go through each individual bottom bracket standard and which crank is it compatible with. And finally, in the last video, I'm going to tell you something about maintenance and the way I install bottom brackets myself. If you'd like to see more tech-related videos like this one, then don't forget to tune into my channel and subscribe. It's all for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.